Welcome, everybody, to Slammed, an Odyssey podcast where we discuss everything Boston Celtics and the NBA at large. I'm Meghan Ottolini of WEI and Odyssey, joined as always by Esteban Bustillos of GBH and Justin Turpin, also of WEI and Odyssey. And guys, we were just talking before the show started, craziest trade deadline in the NBA that any three of us, or I should say any one of the three of us, can remember in our lifetimes. This deadline, beyond the Luka and AD trade, which we'll touch upon, it was just a frenzy out there. And I think since we are a Celtics-centric podcast, I want to start at the Celtics perspective of this, because to me, like the image in my head, and I don't know if this will resonate with everyone in the audience, the image in my head that I had at this trade deadline was the scene in Mean Girls where Regina George is looking over the hallway of the high school as everyone else goes insane because she's released the pages of the burn book. And that's the Celtics. Like the Western Conference in particular is insane right now with the way that these teams, the landscape has been shaken up. The Eastern Conference, there are trades over here that are either salary dumps or just don't make sense at all to me, and we'll get into them. But it's kind of nice if you're a Celtics fan to be an innocent bystander who can grumble about perhaps a salary dump in Jaden Springer and be a little intrigued by Torrey Craig being brought in during last night's game. But otherwise, you're looking around at a league that's really reacting to the most dominant roster, even though they lost last night.
Yeah, I will say the Springer, I think you're right. I think it's just like they're looking at what his future value may be and be like, we probably can't trade that guy or pay that guy too much more down the line. A little disappointing just because I think all of us had been like, wow, this guy had really shined in some key moments. He had the Jaden Springer game, not too long ago.
Against the Clippers.
Yeah. I will say maybe the secret trade here is allegedly the Celtics now have Megan Thee Stallion as a fan with Torrey Craig, allegedly in a relationship. I'm not 100% sure. The websites that I looked at reporting this were not necessarily the most credible places that I've ever gotten information from, but a solid guy to sort of shore up the rotation.
It should be interesting for the sidelines, right? If that's true, we got to get a Megan Thee Stallion sighting at TD Garden. I think that would like up the celebrity level a little bit from perhaps the Donnie Wahlbergs of the world that we're used to seeing in big games.
100%.
Yeah, that guy doesn't fit big game material. No offense to Donnie, but he doesn't scream big game material.
Watch yourself. You're going to get my fellow dot rats on you.
After they win the Eastern Conference Finals, the first thing they show is Donnie Wahlberg. I mean, what are we doing?
Oh, so what do you feel about Terp, the Celtics status as we pass the trade deadline? As I know you were a Springer fan as well, big fan of his defense. It's clear that this was a move that they were making to get under the luxury tax and bringing in Torrey Craig. I wrote about this for WEI.com. I just think increasingly the Celtics have been the kind of team that makes their moves in the summer, makes their moves as a roster well before the season even starts. The only real impactful trade deadline that I can remember for this iteration of this team was 22 when they added Derek White. And even that looked like, hey, here's this fun rotational player from San Antonio that Ime Udoka, the coach at the time, already knows. So there's a pre-existing relationship, but none of us expected him to turn into somebody who was a fringe guy in all-star conversations for the past 2 years.
Yeah, I thought the Springer thing you saw it coming from the fall. I mean, they try to shop him in the fall, possibly to bring in Lonnie Walker at that point, but it was the most logical thing. I mean, you save $15 million against the tax by trading him away. He's on a $4 million expiring deal. So it made sense. The only thing I was hoping that his recent play, especially that Clippers game, might have made him a little bit more than just a salary dump because you bring back a 20-30 pick. So you were hoping it was a little bit more than that, but it's no surprise. I mean, especially when they re-signed everyone in the offseason. You knew that Brad Stevens was going to double down on this group. And that was my biggest takeaway listening to him talk last night, is just how much he believes in this group. And he's given them every reason to believe in them. I mean, I understand they've been inconsistent over the last 8 weeks, but they're the only team in the NBA in top 5 in offensive, defensive, and net rating, and they still have the 3rd best record in the league. They've been coasting for over 50% of the year, and they still are that dominant. So he has every reason to believe in them, and the inconsistency has been a problem, but he wasn't going to blow it up and start making these seismic changes just based off these struggles they've had recently. He fully believes in this group, and it was apparent in the summer. He declared in the summer right before the draft that he thought this team deserved a chance to run it back, and he's given them that chance, and nothing was going to change. I mean, all the Twitter GMs and everyone wants to speculate for fun. Of course, it's the trade deadline. Like, that's part of the fun, but there was no moves that was going to come to this team. So I'm happy with what they did, just standing pat, and it's nice to just sit back and relax for a trade deadline.
Yeah, absolutely. Any move, I think, that would have really, I don't know, shaken up this team would have been reactionary to, as you said, the last 8 weeks. And they just don't operate that way. Brad Stevens has never operated that way. Speaking of reactionary, I do want to get into the biggest trade of the past week, the biggest trade probably in NBA trade deadline history. I don't think anyone's really come up with a comparison. And that's the Luka Doncic for Anthony Davis trade that, of course, involved the Jazz. We're going to hit on this one quickly because if you're interested in the NBA, you've already probably dissected this trade from each angle. I thought it was really curious to hear Jason Kidd before the game last night talking about getting to the finals last year, seeing Boston there, and somebody, Nico, perhaps making the decision that Luka Doncic is not enough to get you back to being in serious finals contention in the next couple years, and framing it as Anthony Davis being this two-way player that's going to bring this impact on defense. And that's something that they learned through going through the Celtics. I don't know if I completely buy that as like a huge reason that they decided to trade Luka. You'd have to spend a lot of time with me to adequately explain something that I would accept as a reason to trade Luka. You just don't see that trade in the NBA. But I'm curious, Esteban, starting with you, do you feel like there's something real to that argument that the Mavericks, what they saw in the Celtics in the finals was enough for them to get through a couple months of the season and say, Luka's not going to do it for us in the short term. We'd rather have 32-year-old Anthony Davis because he's a two-way player.
Like, I get it. And I have heard like the arguments of you can't win when you're without your best player being like a two-way guy. But I also like that they're like, as a lot of other people have said, there has to be something else going on that we're just not necessarily privy to. And also, you know, I understand the arguments, but like when Steph Curry, we never looked at him necessarily like, oh, that's like a defensive stalwart, right? Like they put pieces around him, you know, or even like in Dallas's case, nobody was ever going to necessarily put Dirk on a first team all defense, right? In the NBA. But they, especially in like that 2011 run, but they put people around him. And also, you know, Luka's 25. Like, he would figure it out. So, no, I don't necessarily buy into it. Still shocking. I mean, we were there. Turp and I were there in Dallas for games 3 and 4. We saw firsthand how much people love Luka. I talked to a guy who wrote his name in as a candidate for Texas land commissioner. Outside of one of the games, like those people are obsessed with the man.
Wait, but going back to something you just said, Esteban, because the comparison to Curry, I think, is an interesting one where, yeah, Curry's not a defensive guy, and he's incredible offensively. So is Luka in a very different skill set. If Curry was missing time at the point in his career where Luka is because of, say, the ankle injuries that he had very, very early on in the NBA, would that have put him more in a similar situation to what Luka's been in, where there are concerns about whether you think they're real or not about his fitness and availability?
Well, I mean, and like in a different scenario, we know that almost happened, right? That Golden State actually almost thought about shipping him out, and to their credit, didn't. So I think, you know, GMs, executives, they're always trying to make the best guesses. And sometimes those guesses are just wrong. I think that's what the situation is going to be here, that their guess was wrong. But I think like a lot of people said, that there is still more that's going to be uncovered and unpacked about this trade for years from here.
Nico Harrison is essentially putting his career on the downfall of Luka Doncic, a guy who's been first team All-NBA 5 years in a row, top 8 in MVP voting each of those years, was the Eastern or Western Conference Finals MVP and the scoring champ last year. So I don't care if he's 270 pounds. If you want to claim that, the dude could still score, and he's still a top 3 player in the game consensusly. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find someone that would call Luka Doncic out of the top 3. But like, my whole thing is, if you don't want to pay him the $345 million max extension because you're worried about the conditioning, that's fine. Like, that is understandable. That's a lot of money. I don't believe it. I don't think that's right, but maybe they know something we don't. The problem is you didn't shop him. Like, you didn't even try. Mikal Bridges just went for 5 first-round picks 3-4 months ago, however long September was. I don't even know. He just went for 5 first-round picks. Like, you could have gotten so much more for Luka Doncic. It's malpractice not to shop him. It just makes no sense. And then, it's the funniest thing is Rob Pelinka thanking Nico Harrison for not engaging with any other conversations and saying how he convinced him not to. Does that not sound an alarm? Like, you are being used. Like, I just can't believe they didn't shop him. Like I said, if you don't want to pay him the $345 million, that's a lot of money. And clearly, like you said, Esteban, there must be something we don't know. And I think that's a consensus from a lot of people. Yeah. But to not shop him just makes no sense, because there was going to be a team out there that would have overpaid. Like, just look at the trade packages that went around just even after that deal. Like, there were teams out there that would have given their heart and soul. They would have given you the keys to their damn arena for Luka Doncic, and you didn't even shop him. That's the biggest problem with it for me.
Yeah, there is something very weird about the whole thing, including the LeBron aspect of it, that he finds out about it when he's at dinner. Anthony Davis is a close friend of his, and of course, they're both represented by Clutch. It all is just like, I understand why it lends itself to some conspiracy theories, because it's just really unusual. The way that it unfolded is really unusual. But again, I know people have spent an entire week talking about this, and we're looking at things from a Celtics angle. We also have a bunch of other crazy trades to get into. We will get to the Spurs trade, Esteban, but I want to hit really quickly on Jimmy Butler, because this is one that unfolded yesterday. Jimmy Butler to the Warriors in a 6-team trade. With a lot of details, but essentially the Heat get Kyle Anderson, Davion Mitchell, Andrew Wiggins, Golden State's 2025 first-round pick, which is protected. I think notable to you, Turp, Jimmy Butler gets a $111 million extension in the Bay. This is a guy who is slightly older than me, and I can't believe that they're giving him this extension. I like a lot of things about Jimmy Butler, and I actually like the pairing with the other pieces on Golden State from the way that they can complement each other on the floor. Like, I think from that perspective, it's like a B+ kind of trade for Golden State. And it's a nice kudos to Steph for the last chapter that you have to imagine of his career as being the guy in the Bay. But I don't understand that extension, especially when you've seen the way that it ends for Jimmy Butler. I think that this trade will probably age like milk.
Yeah, I'm with you. I give Golden State credit. I mean, obviously Steph has been lobbying to try to get another star. Just give him a chance to at least make a run, as you said, as he kind of winds the final chapter here. But to give him that extension just makes no sense to me. Not only does he just go sour everywhere he goes, he's barely on the court. And this whole playoff Jimmy thing's 3 years old now? It's over. It's not a thing anymore. It's just holding on to the past. Like, I think they tried a little bit too hard to kind of please Steph there, and it's going to set him up for failure in the future. And Steph deserves that. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, he deserves a shot with another star to make a run. But I mean, that's just not the move. And especially because you knew you were trading for a guy who, at least he was on their list, but is an unrestricted free agent. So you knew an extension had to come. It's just that price for a player that age that's not really on the floor, who can easily get disgruntled and want out. I mean, it's not a great trade. It doesn't move the needle for me either on either side for the players. Like, I mean, they're going to go from the 10 seed to maybe the 9 seed. It's really.
I think it helps them. Like, if they're in the play-in, I do think that Jimmy, if he's healthy enough, is used to flipping the switch in the playoffs. I do think it maybe takes them another round. And again, it's a credit for Steph if this is a move that he wanted. I just don't get the extension. I think it's such a short-term idea, and long-term, they're just putting off the rebuild that's ultimately going to be very tough for them in the post-Curry era.
Yeah,
I also think.
No, I was going to say it does sort of reek of a rare thing for Golden State, which is like desperation, which we haven't really seen from them in the past decade. You know what I mean? Of paying yesterday's stars today's money. That's not something that they've really done. So I think from that sense, yeah, it is a little bit shocking.
I also wonder if it was a late pivot from Kevin Durant, because all the reporting coming out of there is that they wanted the reunion with Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant didn't want the reunion with them. So maybe they went all in on KD. Like they thought they had a real shot. And it sounded like a trade was close. And then Kevin Durant was actually the one that came down and said, it's not happening. I have no interest. So maybe they went all out on that and they kind of had a pivot because it happened a little bit later. It happened the night before, but it happened a little bit later. So maybe that was like, we got to keep Steph happy. Obviously, there's been all these conspiracies of him possibly meeting up with LeBron. You don't want him to end his career anywhere other than Golden State. So to keep him happy, you go out and get a star. And for a guy that's won all the championships and, you know, one of the greatest of all time, he deserves that. But yeah, I think also part of it was the Kevin Durant factor that they had to pivot off him and bring somebody in to keep everyone happy.
Yeah, I'm also fascinated to see how do Jimmy Butler and Draymond Green work together on the same side. And also just like, I don't think Jimmy has been a number 2 guy since he was in Chicago. How does that work this time where now you're like, you have to take a back seat to Steph?
I guess you could say, I mean, he kind of was in Philly and that didn't go well. Didn't go well. So that's one data point. Keeping it moving though. Of course, this is a big one for you, Esteban, because you're a San Antonio guy. Spurs get De'Aaron Fox in a 3-team trade. They're pairing him with Wemby, which I think is an insanely genius move. Kings get Zach LaVine from Chicago. This entire move was just a huge bummer if you're a Bulls fan. But if you're a Spurs fan, this is kind of, to me, the opposite of what the Warriors just did. This is such a smart move, and I think it'll have an immediate impact for the Spurs, and I'm so excited to see what this team's going to be at this time next season.
Well, yeah, and they both had 24 in Fox's first game when they played the Hawks the other night. They didn't give up Stephon Castle. They didn't give up Vassell. They didn't give up Harrison Barnes or Chris Paul or Keldon Johnson. None of like their guys who are sort of in the key rotation, they didn't give up. And the secret part of all of this, which is sort of a long shot, but could happen, is that the Spurs have the Hawks pick in the draft. And if the Hawks get into the lottery, there's a chance that goes 1, and then Cooper Flag is in San Antonio. So who knows?
My God.
Who knows how everything plays out? But yeah, this outside of the Lakers, I think you could say the best outcome for the trade deadline was San Antonio, especially.
Yeah.
I think
they won. I think they won it. I mean, the Doncic trade to me is like in a completely different stratosphere. So that one's crazy. But this is De'Aaron Fox was the big piece that everybody was looking for at the trade deadline, and to get him with Wemby is it's a huge deal.
Yeah, another trade actually I want to talk about that we didn't mention on the rundown, but I was fascinated by. How do you feel about Chris Middleton?
Oh God,
talk with Kyle Kuzma, because that's going to have an impact on the Celtics. But also, I was looking, I was like, this doesn't. Am I the only one who thinks that doesn't make any sense?
Okay, well, we can jump right ahead to these 2 trades in the East. You're right. I forgot to throw this one in here, but I'm glad you brought it up. 2 trades in the East that make absolutely no sense to me. Kuzma, maybe he will be a different guy with a team that is playing for something. Maybe Doc Rivers will bring something out of him. But I just think that his efficiency has been so poor. I understand Chris Middleton is injured to the point that they had lost confidence in him in Milwaukee, but I just don't. Seems like such a gamble on Kuzma. And then the other one that I'd throw in there, because I think when you look at what the West is doing versus the East, it's like, what is wrong with the East? I mean, the Eastern Conference, there's just the Cavs made an awesome move, and we'll get to that. But the Raptors going for Brandon Ingram, I'm like, why did you do this? You're 5 games out of the play-in tournament. Last time I checked, in the East. Like, this isn't the West where it's a little bit like there's a lot of good teams that could be on the bubble. This is the East. And the Raptors just seem every year like they don't want to rebuild. They think every year is a gap year. And it's such a bizarre move. So neither of those moves make sense to me. I think that those are 2 big loser moves at the trade deadline in the East. Chirp.
I feel so bad for Chris Middleton. I mean, that's the first thing that just went to my mind. It was just like sad music. Like, this is what's become of this guy. He was so fun to watch when he was healthy. Even recently in the playoffs, he was a great contributor. And just the thing with Kyle Kuzma is the Bucks believe right now, or at least they have to believe, that they have a shot with Damian Lillard and Giannis Antetokounmpo. They've built that duo, and as much as it may seem bleak,
but is Kuzma the piece that's going to get them to a different level?
Not at all.
Like, is that going to bring them up with the Knicks?
No, I'm not saying that at all, but at least he's
I don't understand why they think that.
You're just getting somebody that's going to play. I think that's the big thing. Like, I mean,
that's a low bar.
It is a low bar, but he'll get in there, he'll rebound, he'll knock down shots at probably a better clip than he has been because he's not going to be jacking up as many. So I think it's just somebody that's going to be on the floor, that's someone that's going to contribute, because you never know what's going to happen with Middleton. So I feel bad, and it's actually especially sad that Giannis kind of greenlighted it and gave Kyle Kuzma the strong vote of confidence that pushed Middleton out the door. So I feel bad for him, but it needed to happen because they need someone that's going to be on the floor and play.
Yeah. And I think the Brandon Ingram thing, like, I don't know, like it just sort of like evens out, I guess, for both. The thing is, you're right. I think for both New Orleans and Toronto, it doesn't necessarily make either of them better, and like both, like if that's like, what other point of there is to trade these guys than to try to make your team better in one way or the other, whether that's now or later?
I feel like the Raptors just won't accept who they are right now, which seems to me like a lack of self-awareness. It's like at some point you got to call uncle and accept that you're not in a gap year, that you have to move into a different phase of rebuilding. And I don't know, maybe I'm making too big of a deal out of this, but I feel like they do this kind of at every trade deadline, every offseason. It's like you don't know who you are. And the only explanation I could have is that they're in love with Brandon Ingram. And this is somebody who they had on a short list for a while. So they wanted to jump when he became made available, even if it didn't fit with their timeline. I still just think it's a bizarre move.
Smells like an overpay because he's an unrestricted free agent this offseason.
Yeah, so that's the other thing is like
pay him.
They're thinking this is the only way that they're going to get someone to like him, or maybe him in particular, to Toronto, because we know how hard it is for free agents in Toronto. But it just is. It seems
another
a little
guy that's
odd.
Not always on the court. Like, that's another thing. Like, if you're going to give this guy seemingly a lot of money, you'd assume that he's going to get a nice payday from them if they just went out and traded all his capital for him at the deadline. And he's not really on the court. Like, it just doesn't fit really for what they're doing. I thought that was probably the weirdest at the deadline. Like, I mean, obviously the Luka one was really bizarre, but that was up there too.
Okay, one more that has immediate implications, because I don't want to talk about how much it bums me out that Marcus Smart has basically been relegated to the Washington Wizards. I want better for my guy. And I say that as somebody from DC. I really don't want to get into that. It just bums me out. But the Cavs, the Celtics are the hunted. The Cavs got themselves a hunter. They got DeAndre Hunter. Scares me a lot. I think this is a really good pickup for the Cavs. I think this is somebody who's going to match up really well with the Celtics when they decide to not have their double big lineup out there. And you know that Joe Mazzulla doesn't always love rolling with the double bigs, although we've been seeing a little bit more of it recently. How much do you guys think this changes the Cavs? I don't think it makes them like the favorite in the East for me personally. I still would have the Celtics, but I do think that it makes them a much better matchup individually in a 7-game series against Boston.
Yeah, I'll say I was a little, I guess, surprised when I was like, oh, they're giving up Niang and Levert, who we've both seen have done some really solid minutes in the Cavs rotation. But then looking at DeAndre Hunter's numbers, have not necessarily watched a whole lot of the Hawks, but then seeing what he's done and how he's grown. I mean, he's almost a 40% shooter from 3. I think that's like having a big that can do that consistently for Cleveland's that's going to make them. I think that's going to make them even tougher. Maybe not as deep as they were. That's like the one thing that hurts in this trade. Again, losing some of that depth in Yang and LeVert, but yeah, I think it makes them a better team. I really do.
That's a big upgrade for a position they needed at the wing. But looking at it from a Celtics angle, there's two things that immediately stuck out to me. Number one, if you were worried about him gaining ground on Peyton Pritchard as sixth man of the year, he now might slide into the starting lineup and will fall back behind, which would mean Pritchard skyrockets up.
Victory for Pritchard.
Yes, that was my first thought.
This is the important point.
Thank you for bringing that up. 4 games.
Is there like a limit, like a game, like a number? Like, do you have to have been sixth man the entire year?
There must be.
I believe you have to come off the bench more than you started, I believe, but I should know this too, but I believe that's what it is. Yeah. So if he's only started 4 games, I assume he's going to start for Cleveland, which means Pritchard's going to win sixth man of the year. Second, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have cooked him, and he's a great defender, but they have cooked him in their matchups. So that's another thing, but regardless, he makes them a better team. You're getting a 25-year-old in the midst of his prime. That's a good move for them, and one that definitely makes them a scarier team.
So the only clear explanation I have found in my very quick search is to be eligible for the award, a player must come off the bench in significantly more games than starts.
That's fair. And I guess to your point about Hunter, Tatum and Brown doing well, that's in a Hawks context. That's true. He didn't have Jared Allen behind him. You know what I mean? So, look, I thought that the Celtics win over Cleveland earlier this week was the best. I think I talked a couple weeks ago about signature wins for the Celtics. I think I would put that as a signature win.
And it was very complete.
Yeah, and then they had the last night against the Mavericks, which we're not even talking about for a reason.
It's like a signature loss.
Yeah, so
like the kind of loss that they have this year, and you're like, ugh, God, can we just throw that away?
It's those West Coast road trips. Like, it's happened 3 times now where they go 3-1 on the West Coast and then come back and lose the first game at home. It's so bizarre.
So maybe home court matters. Home court will matter in the finals, is what you're saying.
Maybe, but they also. So I think I pointed this out last time. They're 13-1 after a loss this year. So as long as they win game 1 of each series, they're going to win the series. Like that's just how. That's the math. That's how it works. I don't make the rules. That's just simple math. But real quick on Hunter, I do think he also is kind of the boost they need defensively, because the Cavs over the last month and change have fallen out of the top 20 in defense. So that you bring that guy in, and maybe he's just reassures that discipline and gets them back, because obviously they've been slipping a little bit. So that is important in the short term. Obviously in the long term, what he can do against the Celtics, but in the short term, that's important.
Yeah, I think it makes the next Cavs game here at TD Garden all the more fascinating to be of like, what will the preview of what we all expect to be an Eastern Conference Finals between these two teams look like.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of fun games at TD Garden coming up in this late winter, early spring to see some of these new teams. Of course, they will host the Lakers on March 8th, so that's coming up sooner than you'd expect. And next week, I know I'm going to be there. Hopefully both of you guys will too, and so we can have a little pod after the Wemby game, now the Wemby Fox game at TD Garden. So you should be on the lookout for all of our slammed content. We're going to have a little bit next week, along with the All-Star break that's coming up. Jason and Jaylen both going out to the Bay. And we will be with that Spurs game coverage. It's going to be a fun one. So if you'd enjoyed this podcast, please find it wherever you find your podcasts, including the Odyssey app, which is always free. And you can find us on YouTube, on WEI's YouTube channel. You can find us on Instagram, and you can find us on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it these days. I still call it Twitter. Thanks so much, everybody.